Come to me, all you that are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Amen. Coming off the high of the 4th of July weekend, the last thing I really wanted to talk about were these words. Who wants to talk about burdens on a holiday weekend? But on some days, these words are like balm for my soul. Now, I suspect that they would have meant relatively little to me as a young person like Alex or Raymond or Maddie here in the front row, because I was fortunate to have a fairly charmed childhood with relatively few burdens. As a kid, I spent my summers hanging out with 2 neighbor girls, and the 4th of July was kind of like the apex or the highlight of the entire summer. It was always bittersweet. The sweet part was that we were at the height of barefoot fitness, because we'd already been running around half the summer without shoes, and our sweet little dainty girl feet were already as tough as combat boots, and we could walk across broken glass or burning coals if we had to. But the bitter part of the 4th of July meant that the summer was half over, and soon we would be back indoors, back inside, and back to our separate homes and separate lives, and back to our separate schools. But on the 4th of July, we would always find ourselves at the municipal park for the annual firework display. You could always smell the fresh-cut grass, and we would arrive just before twilight and pick out a sweet spot on that sweet-smelling grass and on a soft blanket and lay back on our backs and stare up into the sky and wait for the show. And the entire crowd would actually collectively ooh and ah at each firework explosion. And there we were, just 3 little girls, barefoot on a blanket, with filthy, calloused feet, and watching a fireworks show with not a care or a burden in the world. And it was not until years later in history class that we would learn that our nation's independence did not mean freedom and independence for every human being living in our new nation. Many were still under the yoke of slavery when our country first declared its independence in 1776. And it wasn't until years later that we would learn that the reason why my neighbor Suzanne's father stayed in bed all the time was because he suffered from severe depression. Or that my other neighbor Jennifer's older brother was not away at camp, but was in rehab and then jail. But for those few moments in the dark, looking up at those bright, colorful bursts in the sky, the entire world seemed unburdened. Skinned knees were healed with a kiss, and bruised elbows disappeared with the soft rub of our mother's hand. But then we grew older, and our knowledge increased, and our responsibilities increased, and life happened. And there were so many burdens, so many yokes that we picked up on the way. The yokes that we placed on ourselves, trying to be the best mother, father, daughter, wife, husband, son, student, and employee. The yokes also that society tried to put on us, telling us what we should buy, how we should look, what kind of car we should drive, how much we should even weigh. There are also simply the burdens of trying to survive, just trying to survive in this world, which weighs more heavily on some of us than others. The pressures of work, the pressure of finding work, or the pressure of not having work, and the burden of paying a mortgage or the rent, or the burden of simply finding shelter from the heat and the cold. Many burdens we have absolutely no control over, and often we take our burdens to an expert to fix, like a tax person that does tax returns, or a lawyer or a doctor. But sometimes there are burdens that are so heavy that even our earthly experts cannot fix them. We may feel afraid sometimes or sad. We may feel pain, sorrow, and loss. And with that comes a weariness that is really all too part of the human condition. I wonder what burdens we in this congregation are carrying. And I often think, what is weighing me down? I wonder what might be weighing you down. These burdens aren't new to our generation. The Bible is full of examples. Every kind of burden, every kind of drama and trauma imaginable is within the pages of the Bible. All of us experience it. All of us fall short of what we try to do, as Paul discussed in his letter. And yet, in the midst of the fear and the pain and the sadness, come these words: "Come to me, all you that are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest." And this invitation is not to the powerful and the elite, to those who have it all figured out and going on. It's not to the self-satisfied. No, the invitation is not to them. The invitation is to those who are weary, to weary and carrying heavy burdens. And what does Jesus offer? He offers rest. Doesn't that sound good? Couldn't we all use a rest every now and then? Rest when we are faced with that weariness that goes deep into our bones. Jesus says, "I will give you rest." Now, what does that mean? He's probably talking about something more than a day off, but that's a good place to start. And that takes us all the way back to Genesis, to the very first of our Bible, where it said God rested or ceased to work on the seventh day. It was called the Sabbath, coming from a Hebrew word, Shabbat, and it is at the core of Jewish practice and identity. There are at least three things I think that we can learn from the Jewish observance of Shabbat, or Sabbath. And these three things are that the Sabbath is clearly defined, and that the Sabbath is commemorative, and the Sabbath is celebratory. So first, the Sabbath is clearly defined. The beginning and the end of Sabbath is timed to the minute, just before sundown on Friday and then just after sundown on Saturday. And if you happen to be in the Holy Land on Shabbat, sirens and ram's horns sound throughout the land. And for the observant, there is a definite shift in activities, mainly no work and rest from labors. The Sabbath is seen as a constant reminder that this is a special time and set apart and different from the rest of the week. It's not business as usual. And secondly, the Sabbath is commemorative. It recalls how God worked through history to save God's people. It's a time to remember how God delivered his people from slavery and from that yoke back in Egypt. Maybe, as you look back over your own life, you might see where God has been present and delivered you. And third, it's also celebratory. It's not just absence of work, it's the presence of festivity, a time to set aside worries and burdens just for a moment, and a time for parties and friends and family get-togethers, a time to eat and drink, and a time to share a common meal. So I think we all need a day off, and we would do well to spend it in some clearly defined way, and we would do well to capture some of that festive quality of the Jewish Shabbat and to commemorate how God has worked in our own lives. But we're also offered another dimension of the Sabbath in the person of Christ, who says, "Come to me, all you that are weary and carrying heavy burdens, and I, Jesus, will give you rest." So that's a little bit different. And it says, if Jesus is our way of our tradition Sabbath, the one in whom we find our rest, then this Sabbath is not limited to the seventh day of the week. We may enter his rest and peace at any time and in any place. Now, after promising to give rest to those who are weary and with heavy burdens, Jesus then says, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." So what are we to make of that? Is Jesus just giving us one yoke for another? No. Although yoke is a symbol of oppression and servitude, it's also a symbol for an allied force of two united and pulling together. If you've ever visited a farm, like I did last week, I went and visited Amish farms where they still plowed the fields with oxen. And they had these yokes where two ox would pull the plow together and lighten their burden. So it doesn't mean that we're not going to go through some stuff, that we are not going to have to toil. It doesn't mean that we're not going to struggle. It doesn't mean that we aren't going to have hardships, hard knocks, and hard times. But rather, if we accept this invitation from Jesus, if we come to him and surrender those burdens, he will share that yoke with us. We will not go through it alone. We will be yoked to the one in whom God's kingdom of justice and mercy and love and compassion is personified, the one who always sides with the poor, the weary, and the oppressed. And his invitation to us is to learn his ways. And he says, "Learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart." So that means to be yoked to him is to be yoked to a kind and gentle and humble teacher, the one in whom the weary may find rest and a life of freedom, not servitude. So I encourage you, no matter what burdens you may be carrying, take a moment and rest. Set some time apart for Sabbath. Let your Sabbath be clearly defined, and maybe reflect on how God has been present in your life. In other words, let your Sabbath be commemorative, and accept Christ's invitation. Surrender your burdens. Surrender to the yoke of the freedom of God's grace. And finally, let your Sabbath be celebratory, and never miss an opportunity to see and enjoy fireworks. Amen.